In this video you will learn how to configure a virtual firewall on a master engine cluster. In a previous video you deployed a master engine cluster. Now it is time to configure a virtual firewall to it. You will create a new virtual firewall to the Acme domain while a master engine hosting the virtual firewall is in a shared domain. You will enter a shared domain to configure the master engine. The Paris master firewall will host the new virtual firewall. You will need to edit its properties. A virtual resource must be created before creating a new virtual firewall element. Virtual resources are used to group interfaces that are allocated to the specific virtual firewalls. Allocated interfaces can be physical or VLAN interfaces. A good practice is to name the virtual resource with a meaningful name so that it can be easily identified. Because the virtual firewall will be in the Acme domain, you will allocate this resource there. Acme has ordered the virtual firewall with 100 megabits per second throughput, so you will need to define the throughput limit for the resource. This limit is the total limit across all interfaces in the virtual firewall. The virtual resource view will also list all interfaces that are configured to it. Let's review the network where the virtual firewall will be deployed before creating the interfaces. User traffic from accounting and visitor networks will go through Acme Paris virtual firewall, then to the internet. Thus, the firewall will need 3 interfaces. The internet connection uses a shared interface as other virtual firewalls will use the same internet connection. The accounting and visitor network connect to master engines using a VLAN. Now you can create the interfaces that the new virtual firewall will use. You can share the physical interface between multiple virtual resources. This configuration allows multiple virtual firewalls to connect to the same interface. The MAC address prefix defines the common part of the MAC address that the shared interface will use. Each virtual firewall appends a different final octet to the MAC address prefix. In this case, this interface is an internet connection that will be used by multiple virtual firewalls. Now you will create a new physical interface. VLANs will be defined under it, and these will be allocated to the virtual resource. The cluster MAC address specifies the MAC address that the virtual firewalls will use in this interface. You should define the cluster MAC address because virtual firewalls will then be able to use this MAC address no matter which master cluster node they are running on. When the virtual firewall migrates from one master cluster node to another, the switches need only update their MAC forwarding tables. If you do not define the MAC address, then the virtual firewalls will use a different MAC address on each master cluster node. This can cause delays for traffic flow recovery through the virtual firewall, because surrounding network devices need to update their address resolution protocol tables. VLAN interface ID 1 is for the accounting department network. The VLAN interface is allocated to the virtual resource by selecting it in the interface properties. You can define which virtual firewall interface ID this VLAN interface is mapped to. The interface ID will be left to the default value in this case. Enter a value in the comment field for your own reference. Visitors will be using the network in VLAN interface 2 for internet access. The configuration steps are the same as the steps you followed for VLAN interface 1. Refreshing the master cluster policy will transfer all interface changes and virtual resource changes to the master engine policy. Let's jump to the end of the policy refresh dialog. The new virtual firewall will be configured to the Acme domain, so you will now move there. Virtual firewalls are created using this specific element. There are no role-specific virtual firewall elements. Likewise, there is no role selection for virtual firewalls. The master engine role determines the virtual firewall role. The name and virtual resource are the only mandatory configuration settings in the General tab. Interfaces have been created based on the selected virtual resource configuration. Master interfaces associated with the virtual resource are used as virtual firewall interfaces. The IP address configuration will be done in the virtual firewall configuration view. First you define the IP address for the Internet interface. Then you will configure the IP for the accounting network interface. The last interface is for the visitor network. Because the virtual firewall has internet connectivity, it will need a default route to the internet. Routing configuration is done in the same way as a normal NGFW. Now that the IP address and routing configuration is complete, the virtual firewall still needs a policy so that it can process traffic going through it. Virtual firewalls will not connect to SMC services, but a firewall template is still the recommended starting point for policies, as it will automatically allow connections required by used features. Name the policy as Paris Virtual Firewall Policy. Policy configuration is done in the same way as normal NGFW, so you can skip to the finished policy. At this point, the Paris Virtual Firewall needs to only allow basic internet access and the NAT policy. A single NAT rule translates traffic from internal networks to the virtual firewall's public IP. Now that all required configurations are done, you can push the policy to the virtual firewall. Remember that you already refreshed the policy on the master engine after the interface configuration was done. If the interface configuration changes are done at the master level, then the master policy must be refreshed. A typical policy change in the virtual firewall policy does not require a master policy refresh. Finally, after a policy push, the Paris virtual firewall will be ready to process traffic through it.